I'm Clark Farmer. I'm a teaching assistant professor at the University of Colorado Boulder. I teach in the Department of Cinema Studies and Moving Image Arts. I teach mostly courses on film history and film theory. I'm particularly a fan of the films of Christopher Nolan. I remember seeing Memento back in the year 2000 and have followed his career since then. Christopher Nolan, in an interview, once said that he was an indie filmmaker working within the studio system. He's somebody who very self-consciously draws from sort of a tradition of art cinema and infuses that into the genre of the blockbuster movie. In worldwide box office, his films have made over $6 billion. He's somebody, if you kind of just look at the numbers, one of the most financially successful filmmakers of all time. And often when we look at filmmakers who are like incredibly commercially successful, they're not always sort of artistically successful. You know, somebody like the Russo brothers, you know, they make Avengers, Endgame, one of the highest grossing films of all time, but nobody sort of thinks of them as being sort of artistically ambitious. One way to think about it is that Christopher Nolan was actually once attached to do a film like the Odyssey. Wolfgang Petersen was producing the film Troy back in 2004. Christopher Nolan was attached to that. But then Wolfgang Petersen decided that he wanted to take that over. Now, Wolfgang Petersen is somebody who, you know, made kind of commercial blockbuster films, but didn't have all that much sort of artistic ambition for them. And that film proved to be both kind of a commercial and a critical failure. So it's kind of interesting that, you know, Christopher Nolan is kind of returning to that theme after more than 20 years. We think of him as directing, you know, the Batman trilogy, and he somehow managed to make those films really artistically ambitious in terms of their style, of their theme, of their scope, and made films that, you know, were incredibly popular with audiences, but also with critics. You know, that these, you know, some of the few sort of superhero films actually be nominated for awards in major categories. When we kind of think about him, somebody who's able to kind of bridge this divide, not simply between commercial cinema and art cinema, but really between kind of blockbuster cinema, that films that make millions and millions of dollars, and having this sort of more artistic sensibility. We sometimes think of the Odyssey, because we're assigned to read it at school, as being kind of high art. And then certainly it is an incredibly important piece of high art. But back in its day, it was also sort of the popular entertainment. In some ways, it's kind of equivalent to Shakespeare, that Shakespeare we think of as being high art, but it's also had this strong appeal to large groups of people. It has a lot of like humor, including scatological humor, sexual humor, and you see similar sort of things with the Odyssey. You know, it tells, you know, a very kind of gripping story. It has monsters in it. It has kind of extreme moments of violence in it. Taking something like the Odyssey and pushing it into kind of the level of the blockbuster and maintaining its kind of artistic integrity, but also something that's enjoyable to watch with a bucket of popcorn. That's exactly, I think, why Christopher Nolan's right for this project. Another thing that makes Nolan well-suited for shooting something like the Odyssey is his commitment to film as a medium, that he is very careful to use practical effects when he can instead of digital effects. He's careful about using location shooting. He's very dedicated to using actual film stock. You know, the Odyssey is shot completely on these giant IMAX cameras, which have very sort of like large frames that contain a lot of information. When you look at something like his Batman films, these are these, you know, superhero films, but they're very much kind of grounded in reality. Nobody has superpowers. There's no sort of garish colors. The ancient Greeks heard these stories, and they had like gods and goddesses and monsters. You know, this wasn't like science fiction. This wasn't mythology. This was describing real life, you know, that they really did believe in those things. And I think it's really well suited to something like the Odyssey, instead of having it seem like this kind of fantastical tale, having it kind of grounded in photographic reality. When Christopher Nolan went to college, his father encouraged him to major in something besides film. So he actually majored in English while sort of working at the Film Society at the college. And He's often talked about in interviews about how his background in reading a lot of theater and novels has really inspired his approach to film. In one interview, Christopher Nolan said that what he really appreciates about a film is that when it can surprise him, when it does something new and different. And I think that's something that he incorporates into his own work. One of the things that he admires from literature is different ways to tell a story. If you have a book, you just have a lot of words. And the words can be, set in the past. They can describe something objective in the real world. They can describe something subjective in somebody's head. When you shoot a film, generally what you're just shooting is kind of the outside of reality. But often film gets sort of dragged into being kind of a form of film drama. On the stage, things occur in kind of like continuous time and space because you have real objects and real people in real time. A book is just words, and it can kind of go anywhere and do anything at any point. I think Christopher Nolan finds ways of kind of combining elements of the novel with theater, that he uses, standard film techniques like cross-cutting or narration to get inside people's heads or tell the story in a different kind of temporal order. And it's within this context that Christopher Nolan's film Memento in 2000 comes out. And what's kind of striking about that is he tells the story completely backwards. It's about a character who has short-term amnesia. And so we actually start at the very end of the movie with him shooting somebody, and then it jumps backwards. And so we very much have to kind of piece this together. An incredible sort of technique. I remember seeing that in the movie theaters and coming out and like feeling completely disoriented. I'd never seen anything like that in a film before. We have films where that's kind of play with how you tell a story is motivated by something within the film. So you have films like Inception, where you have people dreaming, but you have not just, people sort of in this kind of lucid dreaming, but this idea you have layers of lucid dreaming. And so you have, you go deep into the dream, then the second layer, then the third layer, and then down into the abyss. One of the reasons I think this will work really well with the Odyssey is that the Odyssey is this piece of literature that is incredibly complex. We often think of the stories of the Odyssey as, Odysseus' journey home, but that's actually a very small part of the Odyssey, and it's kind of embedded in the middle of the story with Odysseus telling the story before he goes home. Before then, we have this whole section with Telemachus, his son, going off to look for him. The story kind of jumps between different characters. You have these flashbacks. You have people telling stories continually in the Odyssey. One of my favorite scenes of the Odyssey is when Odysseus meets Argos, which is his faithful dog, which he raised as a pup and went hunting with. And he's returned back to Ithaca, and he sees this old mangy dog who's nobody's been taking care of. The dog's eyes light up to see his master, and we get this kind of backstory, and then the dog just keels over and dies. But, the faithful hound has recognized the master and sort of fulfilled the role of being a loyal, waiting servant.